Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video in Jane Austen July. Today I thought I would talk about marriage in Jane Austen's books. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. I think it's fair to say that the opening line to Pride and Prejudice is one of the most famous opening lines of any books. Like, it's pretty well known. And I find the presentation of marriage in Jane Austen's works incredibly interesting. The opening sentence of Pride and Prejudice, that universal truth, tells us two things. One, that men and women are in search of spouses and that marriage is important in this book and in this time, and also that marriage and money are inextricably linked. In this video today, I wanted to talk about Jane Austen's presentation of marriage, how it is used as a plot device and a plot ending, but also how, while many of her books may end in happy weddings, happy marriages are not seen that often in her work. In this video, there are going to be spoilers. There will be spoilers for all of Jane Austen's 6 novels: Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Northanger Abbey, Mansfield Park, Emma and Persuasion. There will not be any spoilers for Lady Susan. I've decided to not discuss Lady Susan very much in this video. If I do mention it, it will be without spoilers, basically because I figured there are probably enough people who've read Jane Austen's 6 books who'll be able to watch this without fearing spoilers, but I know a lot of people haven't read Lady Susan, so I thought it'd be better just to leave it out of this video. So if you haven't read any of Jane Austen's books / haven't seen the TV adaptations or the films and you don't know who ends up with who, maybe don't watch this video and just go do something else. I will have some spoiler-free videos in Jane Austen July, but yeah, not this one. Marriage is very much presented, at least on the surface, as a happy ending in Jane Austen's books. All of her novels end in marriage. Nearly all of them, in fact, end in more than one marriage. So Sense and Sensibility ends in the marriage of Eleanor and Edward Ferrars, and Marianne and Colonel Brandon. Pride and Prejudice ends in the marriage of Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy, of Jane and Bingley, and sort of Lydia and Wickham, though that's like a little bit before the end. Northanger Abbey ends in the marriage of Catherine and Henry Tilney, and Eleanor and her Viscount, who I don't think is ever named. Mansfield Park ends in the marriage of Fanny and Edmund, and also Julia, Fanny's cousin, elopes slightly before the end of the book as well. Emma ends in the marriage of Emma and Mr. Knightley, Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax, Anne Harriet and Robert Martin, and Persuasion ends in the marriage of Anne and Captain Wentworth, and also Louisa and Benwick. So, like, lots of marriages at the ending of her books. And the way the books are structured and the way the plots work means that they are constantly leading up to marriage. Like, marriage is a driving force and a plot point in all of her books. The need to get married, the need or the desire to get married is a kind of driving force in a lot of her books. Often that is a need to get married for sort of financial reasons, such as in Pride and Prejudice, where Longbourn is entailed on the male line, which means if none of the 5 daughters of the Bennet family get married, they will have nowhere to live when their father dies. But regardless of what drives it, the urge to get married is a central plot point and focus in all of Jane Austen's books. And all of them do end in lots of marriages. And marriage is presented, at least on the surface, as I say, as a happy ending. These books have happy endings where couples who love each other get to get married. However, one thing I find incredibly interesting in Jane Austen is that while her books end with the making of happy marriages, there are very few happily married couples presented in Jane Austen. This is actually very similar to Dickens. Dickens is another author where so many of his novels end in like 5 glorious happy marriages, and then if you look for like actually happily married couples in Dickens, there's like 3. Across Jane Austen's novels, I can only think of 4 happily married couples who are like actually seem happy and affectionate with each other. Admiral and Mrs. Croft and Captain and Mrs. Harville in Persuasion, although I'm not sure how much we see of Captain and Mrs. Harville's relationship. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner in Pride and Prejudice, and Mr. and Mrs. Weston and Emma. As far as I can see, though I've probably missed one, like, these seem to be the only happily married couples in Jane Austen's books. Whereas if we look for unhappily married couples in Jane Austen, we can find a lot. One thing that you will find a lot of in Jane Austen is married couples who just seem pretty disinterested in each other, who seem to not know each other very well and not really want to know each other very well, and are just like unaffectionate with each other, such as the Palmers in Sense and Sensibility, or Sir John and Lady Middleton, or Charlotte and Mr. Collins in Pride and Prejudice, or Mr. and Mrs. Hurst in Pride and Prejudice. Do we ever really see them speak to each other? They seem entirely unconnected from each other. Or in Mansfield Park, Dr. and Mrs. Grant, who don't seem to have much to say to each other, Lady and Sir Bertram, who don't really seem to understand each other, Mr. and Mrs. Mrs. Price, Fanny's parents, who are certainly not happy or on the same page. In Emma, we have Mr. and Mrs. Elton, who have got married after like a fortnight's acquaintance and surely can't be happy together. Or in Persuasion, we have Charles and Mary Musgrove, who don't seem to get on and who are always argue about things, and Mary is always complaining about her husband. And then throughout Jane Austen's works as well, we have like properly bad, unhealthy marriages that are more than just a bit unaffectionate. In Northanger Abbey, we get the impression that General Tilney's relationship with his wife was never good. In Mansfield Park, we learn of the Crawfords' relation, the Admiral, and the way that he treated his wife. We also see the breakdown of the marriage of the Rushworths. In Pride and Prejudice, the marriage between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet is terrible. Like, it may be funny on the surface, but actually if you look deeper, he's not very nice to her. He doesn't respect her. He thinks that she's really stupid, and she doesn't understand him at all. And it's just a mess. In Sense and Sensibility, you have Henry Dashwood and his wife, who walks all over him and is just a very unpleasant woman. And we have Willoughby and his wife, who we know he does not love. And in Lady Susan as well, which I know I said I wasn't going to mention much here, but in Lady Susan, the portrait we get of Lady Susan's previous marriage and also her friend Alicia's marriage is pretty awful. Like, while marriage may be presented as a happy ending in her books, it is definitely not presented as a happy middle, and most of the married couples we see in Jane Austen are unhappy together or indifferent to each other. And when you read Jane Austen's books that way, they are much less focused on love and romance, and marriage becomes a much more problematic happy ending. I think it's worth considering as well that when Jane Austen's novels end in marriage, it's not necessarily just an ending to the romance plotline, it's often also an ending to the kind of financial plot lines which go through her books. And often marriage in her work is not just about falling in love, it is also about women gaining financial security and gaining a future for themselves, which, if you were a woman of the class that Jane Austen writes about in the early 19th century, the way you gain security and a position in life was to marry someone, especially if you didn't have that much wealth yourself. Emma, I think, is the only one of Jane Austen's heroines who is self-sufficient enough that she does not need to get married to improve her status. Her status kind of remains the same on marriage. In Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth says to her sister, as a joke, but still, that she can date her change of opinion of Mr. Darcy to "my first seeing his beautiful grounds at Pemberley." And obviously this is a joke. She does love Mr. Darcy and she does want to marry him. But the fact that he is rich does matter, because if she fell in love with someone who had absolutely no money, she, bringing no money, probably wouldn't be able to afford to marry him and still live in the style that she had lived in previously and still hold her head high as a lady. One of the reasons why, although she really likes Wickham, she never takes him that seriously earlier on is because she doesn't have any money and neither does he. So she can't afford to fall in love with Mr. Wickham, whereas she can afford to fall in love with Mr. Darcy. So the marriages at the end of Jane Austen's books are not just closures to the romance plot lines and the love stories, they're also closures to the women's plot lines in terms of finding a place for themselves in the world and finding themselves a new home. The marriage between Fanny and Edmund that takes place at the end of Mansfield Park is the least romantic marriage in many ways in all of Jane Austen's works. Like, we don't see a proposal between them, we barely see like Edmund fall in love with them, we're just told that it happened. And in many ways, Fanny marrying Edmund is as much about her being accepted by that family that she's always wanted to be part of, and her being accepted as Edmund's equal, and her like finding a real home of her own, as it is about her marrying the man she loves. Because in many ways, in my opinion, like, Mansfield Park is a book that's much more about home than it is about love, and she finds a home at the end of the book, and the kind of ending and the marriage between her and Edmund is as much about her finding that home as it is about her finding Edmund. And that first opening line to Pride and Prejudice that is so well known and is so important, it is not just about marriage, it is all about money, because marriage for this class at that time is a lot to do with money. And as I said, one of the reasons why the need to marry drives the plot along in so many of the books is because these women are not financially independent enough to have a substantial and comfortable life on their own unless they marry. But it's also interesting to note that marriage is not just a happy ending to various plot lines, because we also see marriage used as a closure and an ending to the plot line between Lydia and Wickham in Pride and Prejudice, which is not a happy ending. Marriage is used there as a solution to the problem, but it is not a good solution. Like, you cannot imagine that Lydia and Wickham are going to be happy together, and she's only 16. At some point she might grow up and be better than she is. Wickham is in his mid to late 20s and probably isn't going to do as much growing up as she will, and she is saddled with him for life. Like, that is a really sad ending for Lydia, and their marriage is used as a very kind of problematic way of closing a particular storyline in not a happy way. And in fact, I think it's worth considering how marriage is used as a kind of problematic happy ending in a lot of Jane Austen's books. Yes, the endings of her books with love matches between couples look very happy on the surface, but actually if you look deeper, there are a lot of more problematized things. Do we as readers really believe that Edmund loves Fanny as much as Fanny loves Edmund? Do we as readers really believe that Marianne loves Colonel Brandon as much as he loves her? I don't. And I very, very much believe that Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy do love each other. But goodness, can you imagine how their families are going to get on and the problems that that will create? Or consider the ending of Persuasion, where Anne finally marries Captain Wentworth, who she's loved for so many years, but Jane Austen doesn't fail to remind us that their future will not necessarily be completely happy. Anne was tenderness itself, and she had the full worth of it in Captain Wentworth's affection. His profession was all that could ever make her friends wish that tenderness less, the dread of a future war all that could dim her sunshine. She gloried in being a sailor's wife, but she must pay the tax of quick alarm for belonging to that profession which is, if possible, more distinguished in its domestic virtues than in its national importance. In the last paragraph of Persuasion, what Jane Austen tells us is that Anne is incredibly happy with Captain Wentworth, but is going to spend her life constantly afraid that he's going to die in the war because he works in the Navy. Like, that is what the ending of Persuasion says. That is a problematized happy ending. And another thing that is important to remember when reading Jane Austen's books is that for women in the early 19th century, at the time Jane Austen was writing, marriage brought dangers because many women died in childbirth. 4 of Jane Austen's sisters-in-law died from childbirth or complications to do with pregnancy. And a lot of women at that time period did. So while marriage is a happy ending for these women, and marriage is what many women in these books aim towards, and is in many ways the best way for a woman to assure a kind of future and a home for herself, as Charlotte Lucas talks about in Pride and Prejudice, it also does bring dangers with it. And marrying and having children and giving birth was definitely a big risk in this time period. And I think it's important to note as well that Jane Austen herself did not get married. I'm not someone in general who loves using an author's life to back up a critical point, because like when I do literary criticism of this sort, I like to find the stuff in the text myself. However, I think it's still worth noting. Jane Austen did not get married, and many people like to say this is because she never properly fell in love and that she would only marry for love because, you know, that's what her books say. But I think it's also worth considering that maybe Jane Austen chose not to get married because she didn't want to get married. We do know that she received at least one proposal which she accepted and then turned down, and perhaps Jane Austen preferred independence and not going through the risks of childbirth to becoming a wife. I made a video talking about this ages ago called Is It Sad That Jane Austen Never Got Married, which I'll link down below. And while marriage is the aim of many of Jane Austen's characters, it's important to remember that after they're married they might well have spent their lives, as did one of Jane Austen's sisters-in-laws who got married at the age of 18, spent the next 17 years of her life going through 11 pregnancies and then died in childbirth with her 11th child. Like, marriage is not always necessarily that safe or that fun for women in the Regency period. Which is perhaps one of the reasons why in Jane Austen's novels you find a lot of happy weddings at the end of the book, but not very many happily married couples in the middle. So I think that is all I had to say about marriage in Jane Austen. I hope this video has been interesting. Please let me know down in the comments what you think about marriage in Jane Austen and how it is presented in her works. And that is all. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.